Let's continue looking at the additional question types. In the previous video, we went over short answer, paragraph, multiple choice, check boxes, drop down, and file upload. Now let's go to linear scale. When you want to use a linear scale, this is basically like a Likert scale. So you have 1 to 5, 1 to 10, however you want it to be. You are asking your participants to rate something in that area. So you have to first enter your question. So in this particular question, I'm asking the participant to rank the familiarity with using Google Keep. So now I need to decide what my scale or my range is going to be. So you'll notice you can start at 0. So in this particular case, I'm going to start at 0. That to me is indicative of I have 0 experience or familiarity. So then I can decide to go all the way up to 10. So again, your range for linear scale is going to be between 0 and 10, and you can decide what you want those to be. I'm going to go ahead and use just a 5-point range. And now I need to label what does 0 mean and what does 5 mean. So I've entered my 0 is not at all familiar and 5 is I can teach others about it. So let's look at what that particular linear scale would look like to a participant by clicking on our preview button and scrolling down to our question. Rank your familiarity with using Google Keep. So you see they receive a range of little buttons and they can click where they feel they are on that familiarity range. So that's what it looks like to your participants. Now let's add a new question, and this time let's do the multiple choice grid. Now a multiple choice grid is going to have rows that have content choices and columns that have content choices. So it's a little more involved than doing a ranking or a linear scale. So let's take a look at a sample question that you might use for the multiple choice grid. So I'm going to ask teachers how often they use these particular apps with students. So now that I've entered my question, in my rows, I'm going to put the different types of apps, and in my columns, I'm going to use something similar to what we did in the last one and have a scale type response. You'll see here in my rows, I've listed my applications, and in my columns, I've listed the frequency for how often. So I do want to point out to you that at the bottom of this, instead of required, it says require a response in each row. Now what that would mean for this particular question is that I'm requiring the respondent to select a frequency for every application. You can decide to do that or not. Just remember that if there's some that depending on your question, it may not make sense to require this. So you really need to think about that and also take a look at it in the preview mode. In this particular case, I do want to know for every single one of these apps how often they're used. So I am going to require a response here. I'm going to preview this and show you what this looks like. So when you take a look at this, it shows my rows are the applications, and across the top, my columns, this is the frequency. And I'll notice it's required. So in order to submit, I would have to make a choice in each of the rows and submit before this question would be considered complete. So that is a multiple choice grid. So now let's move on to our next option. And the next option is checkbox grid. A checkbox grid is almost identical to the choice grid, with the difference of I can choose multiple items in each row. So let's think of a question that this may be appropriate for. So you'll see here I've entered my question, when do you enjoy participating in these activities? I have rows of activities and my columns are different times of the year or I don't participate. So this is going to be a place where they could choose multiple columns to go with each row. So let's take a look at what that looks like to a respondent. So when I preview this, I can see here are my activities and I can choose multiple columns. So I like swimming at any time of the year. Dancing, I like doing that at any time of the year. Well, maybe not so much in the fall because I like to be outside. Yoga is all during the year, but I really only like skiing in the winter. So I can choose multiple columns to go with each row. So that's the type of question that would go with the checkbox grid, which is basically the same as the multiple choice grid, but you can put multiple choices in each row. Also, in this type of question, you can require a response in each row. That's why I added I do not participate, because if I did not have I don't participate, but I have a respondent who doesn't do one or all of these activities, they wouldn't really be able to answer the question honestly, because I did not provide them with that. So that's something else to think about if you are requiring responses. So let's move on to another question type. After the checkbox grid, you'll see date and time. These are super easy questions, and they're exactly what they seem to be. So for a date type questions, you are asking for a specific month, date, and year. This might be great for a history question, but let me enter my question. So here I have on what date was the last presidential election. And so if I go into preview mode, you'll see on what date was the last presidential election. They can click and type, but they also can click the little calendar and choose the date that way. Super easy. So now let's go and add our last question type, and the last question type is time. The time question is exactly the same as the date question in that you are looking for a specific AM or PM time. So in this particular question, what time does our lunch bell ring? I'm looking for an exact time. So if I go into preview mode and find this question, you'll notice I can put typing in an hour, typing in a minute, and I get a drop down for AM and PM. So that is a time question. So we've gone through all the variety of question types. There are lots of different types of questions. So I hope you've learned a lot about the different types of questions you can add to your Google form.